subject is the Antichrist, an alternative view. What we're going to explore is the possibility, at least, that there may be a very widespread myopia regarding the subject of the Antichrist that we too have fallen into. And so we're going to try to stand back from our presuppositions of the past and try to let the text speak to us. And if we're correct, we may come up with some real surprises. Quite a different perspective from the very commonly presumed scenario for the end times. So let's just start backwards a little bit. We all talk about Armageddon, that climactic battle at the end of the age, getting its name, of course, from Revelation 16:16. He gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon, which is Armageddon or Mount Megiddo, if you will. And that's a literal place on the planet Earth. In fact, if you take the planet Earth and zero in to a particular piece of real estate called Israel, you'll discover there is a place that you can visit called Megiddo, overlooking a valley, the valley of Jezreel. On the opposite side of that valley is the city of Nazareth up on the hill. It's kind of interesting that from Megiddo you see Nazareth. When Jesus was being raised as a child, he would look across that valley and see Megiddo. And you wonder, you can't help but speculate, how much did he know as a child? Most scholars presume that he came into his full knowledge at his baptism, but who knows? But the valley of Jezreel, there really isn't a battle of Armageddon, by the way. That's what we all speak of it. Armageddon has a relationship to Jerusalem that England did to the Normandy invasion. In other words, it's the gathering place. But the target, of course, is Jerusalem. And all of us have seen the little maps in prophecy books which talks about the sequence of the Battle of Armageddon, which is actually detailed in Daniel 11. It starts by a push by the kings of the south against the king of the north. And we usually see the European Confederacy coming in, and everything's going swimmingly until the kings of the east are on the horizon. And it's commonly envisioned as a four-power conflict. And setting aside for the moment who the kings of the south and kings of the north are, these are all idioms from Daniel chapter 11. The question is, where do we find this Western Confederacy in Daniel 11? If you look, you won't find it there. It's an inference we draw because we know from other passages that the Antichrist comes from the Roman Empire. And out of this come all kinds of conjectures that the Antichrist is a Western European-based leader. And we're going to explore that. If you look at Daniel 11, we'll discover that there isn't a Western Confederacy as such. But let's step back all the way to the beginning. The earliest civilizations are generally recognized as having started in what we call the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, in a region that becomes central to most of history. And a city in the Assyrian Empire called Babylon, ultimately under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, becomes an empire, and it is succeeded by the Persians, and the Persians are succeeded by the Greeks, and that brings us up almost to the Roman period. In fact, the leader that we're going to spend some time looking at is Alexander the Great, a young guy that at the age of 29 found no more worlds to conquer. In 11 years, he conquered most of the known world. And when he dies, at his peak, actually, his empire is divided among his four generals: Cassandra, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy. And since Israel, the two powerful players are Seleucus and Ptolemy, and as rivals, they constantly engage over this buffer state called Israel. And so we often speak of the 400 silent years. Those are the years between the Testaments. The Old Testament ending at the book of Malachi, and the New Testament, of course, with the Gospels. And roughly 400 years between those are sometimes called the silent years. Well, that's overlooking the fact that much of that history during those 4 centuries is detailed in advance in Daniel chapter 11. So we're going to discover that Daniel 11 is a very key passage to really understand for many reasons. But obviously after the Greek Empire came the Roman Empire, and most of us are familiar with that. Except most of us make a mistake about that I'll come to. We know that the Antichrist comes from the Roman Empire in its extension. And the most fundamental passage for end-time Bible studies is the 70 weeks of Daniel, the last 4 verses of Daniel chapter 9. And if you haven't studied that, one of the things you want to do is undertake a diligent study of the last 4 verses of Daniel 9. If you understand those 4 verses, then everything else will fall into place. Now, people who are confused about those 4 verses will turn out to have all kinds of other problems in trying to lay out the end-time scenario. The 70 weeks consist of 4 verses, verse 24, which gives you the scope of the whole thing, then 69 weeks of years in verse 25, and then an interval, and then a final 7-year period in verse 27. Those are the 4 segments that make up this fabulous passage. The 69 weeks are in and of themselves the most profound substantiation of the Word of God than you can find. Gabriel gives Daniel a precise mathematical formula that from the commandment to restore unto Jerusalem and to the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah the King, will be 173,880 days. That's essentially what he says. And we know that what the decree was to restore Jerusalem, and we also know the date that Jesus, the only date he allowed himself to be presented as a king was Palm Sunday. It turns out that Gabriel told Daniel virtually 5 centuries in advance the exact day that the Messiah would present himself to Jerusalem. What makes this particularly provocative, on this timeline, less than halfway through this time is when the entire Old Testament was translated into Greek, called the Septuagint version. That was about 300 years prior to Christ's ministry. So setting aside who wrote Daniel and when he wrote it and all that, it almost doesn't matter. It was in black and white 3 centuries before Christ's ministry, and it predicts with a precision that's astonishing. But after this famous 69 weeks, which I encourage you to really dig into and get the background on, there's an interval in verse 926. In verse 926 says, "And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off," karad, or executed, "but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined." Now, the very fact that the Messiah is predicted to be executed is in the Old Testament is astonishing to many. But as we know, he was. And then there's this interesting phrase, "And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." Well, obviously that happened in 70 AD. And in fact, Jesus predicted it the week that he was crucified. He made a very explicit prediction in Luke chapter 19 and elsewhere. And we all know that the Roman legions had laid an 8-month siege, slaughtered virtually 1 million people, and destroyed the city and the sanctuary. But the people that did that, of course, were the Roman legions. We have here in the middle of this passage a phrase, "the prince that shall come." That's one of 33 titles in the Old Testament that make an allusion to this coming world leader that we tend to call the Antichrist. But here it says, "the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." Well, we know who destroyed the city and the sanctuary were the Roman legions. And this is one of the several passages that identify this prince that shall come, the Antichrist, if you will, as being emerging, if you will, from the Roman Empire. And the prince that shall come. Now, this interval is indeterminate. Jesus is crucified during that interval. The city and the sanctuary destroyed. So that's 38 years at least between these two, between verse 25 and verse 27. Through experience, we've discovered that verse 26 has endured for a better part of 2,000 years. But the day is coming when this interval will be over, the church period will be over, and events will trigger a final 7-year period, which some scholars call the 70th week of Daniel, in which all kinds of things take place. That's not our purpose to go into all that here in this brief time. But we do have this identity from this passage that this